Session 1 is entitled, Is This the Word of the Lord? Texts of Terror in the Hebrew Bible. Let's begin by looking at the warrior god. A dominant theme in the Hebrew Bible is that of the warrior god, especially in the early books of the Hebrew Bible. In those texts, God appears to be the key activist. All reading of the Bible is interpretation. Therefore, interpretation of war narratives in the Hebrew Bible is problematic. We may not always recognise that the texts themselves are already interpretations, theological interpretations, mythological interpretations as well, all of which have been written centuries after an experience or an event. In relation to the warrior god texts, we can take a mythological or historical view of early Israel's history. When we read these texts, do they represent literal history? Or are they representative of what we would call theological history? Or perhaps better, theomyth, or theological mythology? Early Israel was surrounded by neighbour mythology. All the peoples around about had myths and mythologies. Early Israel used some of it, used it in its writings, and used it in subversive and countercultural ways. Israel's neighbours did believe that their gods would fight for them. But unlike Israel, they had no concept that the army was not to fight. According to the book of Exodus, the Lord will fight for us, and you only have to keep still. Here, God will fight, Israel will not. The Exodus story itself is celebrated in military language, but not as military action on the part of the Israelites. All of the battle narratives in the Hebrew Bible are written as theomyth. And perhaps the most historical dimension is the historical context of Israel's existence, and not the historicity of battles. To read the narratives literally is to fail to grasp the reality of Israel's minority existence, that this story and this people are not a big people, but rather the small people or the little people. And we need to recognise that, or we miss the point of the narrative's poetry and myth. The image of the warrior god is perhaps best described as theomythical imagination, cast in the story form of Israel's Near Eastern neighbours, but radicalised through the renunciation of the use of horses and chariots and military technology. Israel is to stand still, or stop fighting, as it can be translated, and know that I am God, a familiar text from the book of Psalms, which we do not always understand as a command or an exhortation to stop fighting and know that God is God. The warrior god tradition and holy wars ended with the establishment of the Davidic state. Now Israel had a king. The clamour had been for a king like all the nations. That meant having a standing army, horses and chariots, and battles to be fought. The prophets saw this as the rejection of God's leadership or God's lordship over the people of Israel.
In looking at violence in the Bible, it's important to look at violence against women in the Bible. There are stories that do not make for pleasant reading, and yet are included in a book that we describe as sacred text. The Hebrew Bible includes stories of violence against women, which appear to have divine sanction. This may not be surprising, since the entire Bible is set in a patriarchal context and reflects patriarchal concerns. But critical discernment is a must, since there is nothing ethical about Abraham passing Sarah off as his sister for Pharaoh's sexual pleasure in order to save his own life. This is a story which does not cast Abraham in any heroic light, but is something of a male chauvinist. There are stories of violence against women where the women do have a name, which in itself dehumanizes them. Patriarchy unnames women, downgrades women like Miriam to elevate the male Moses, and justifies violence against women in the text. It is highly likely that Miriam composed the famous Song of Liberation following the Exodus, but in a world where there was no copyright law, authorship is soon transferred in the story to Moses. There are 4 major narratives of violence against women in the Hebrew Bible: violence against Hagar and Tamar, and 2 women with no names who are victims of very brutal male violence. In Judges 19 verses 1 to 30, we read about the horrific story of an unnamed concubine from Bethlehem. Phyllis Tribble, the American feminist theologian, in her classic book Texts of Terror, says of this story that the betrayal, rape, torture, murder and dismemberment of an unnamed woman is a story we want to forget but are commanded to speak. It depicts the horrors of male power, brutality and triumphalism, of female helplessness, abuse and annihilation. To hear this story is to inhabit a world of unrelenting terror that refuses to let us pass by on the other side. Judges 11 contains a brutal story of the violence against the unnamed daughter of Jephthah. It portrays God as a violent land thief as well as requiring violent human sacrifice. The storyline goes that if God gives Jephthah victory, he will offer human sacrifice, the victim who will be the first to appear at his door to greet him in his victorious homecoming. As it turns out, that person is his unnamed daughter. Even though Jephthah tore his clothes and grieved, he could not go back on his promise, nor does God give him any way out. This violence-oriented relationship between God and Jephthah has been played out often in human history between a male warrior and male deity. To quote Jack Nelson Palmer, as so often happens, when a male warrior and a male deity plan together, the result is violence against women. In the Christian Testament, the letter to the Hebrews cites Jephthah as a hero of faith, who through faith conquered kingdoms because mighty in war. Women received their dead by resurrection. It may surprise us, if not shock us, that a person such as Jephthah is being held up as a hero of faith. Such an accolade is certainly ethically dubious, and no mention is made of his wife or her extreme sorrow at the loss of her daughter at her husband's hand. Is this, as we sometimes say in the liturgy, the word of the Lord? Can we literally say that, or do we need to look for the word of the Lord between the lines? A literal reading is impossible, and to read literally is to read through the lens of the Babylonian myth of redemptive violence. This myth of redemptive violence states that violence achieves, violence liberates, and violence defends. Unfortunately, the myth is still pervasive in our world as an ideology of violence. Israel often used mythical stories to express theological insight. If we can read this story in this way, rather than as literal and factual, then we're encountering a very different insight. This is a story about repentance, reversing course, which means that the story of violence against women is not the way, nor is it the word of the Lord. The brutalized violence and violent God images are not the divine will. The warrior God does not sanction war, nor does God sanction violence. We read these brutal texts of violence in their exilic, displaced, dislocated context as a cry of repentance, a turning away from the ideology of violence to a very different way of life.